This is the story of a young RAF trainee pilot in 1945. That is, me. I was 19. In 1941, when the Japanese bombed the American fleet in Pearl Harbor and they came into the war, they were terribly short of pilots. But not only that, they couldn't find any instructors to train the pilots. So they got to solve that problem first. And what they did was they recruited large numbers of pilots from flying circuses. And they trained the American pilots. It was a big success. The British had another problem. They too were terribly short of pilots. Indeed, it had nearly finished us off in the Battle of Britain in 1940. But their solution was to have training schools for pilots in southern Rhodesia and other parts of southern Africa. Southern Rhodesia is now Zimbabwe. And that too was a very successful solution. Then, in 1943, the two came together. And the Americans gave the British 5 flying schools in the wonderful, sunny southern states of America. And they used the American methods, particularly the civilian flying circus pilots, to train the British pilots. I went to one of these, number 5 British Flying Training School at Clewiston in Florida in the spring of 1945. We were the last course to arrive at that flying school.
What was the actual location of Clewiston?
Well, it was in the most interesting position. It was just south of Lake Okeechobee, which is an enormous lake, about 50 miles across and 50 miles in all directions, and just north of the Everglades, which were just swamp. And we often said that it was just like the Americans. They gave to the British a flying school that was trapped between an enormous lake and an enormous swamp. But at least it gave you an enormous incentive to get back. We did have the weekends off, and at weekends we used to go mainly to West Palm Beach, which was about 50 miles to the east. Miami was about twice as far away, but we usually went to West Palm Beach. And in West Palm Beach there were 2 wonderful Canadians. He was an estate agent, and he and his wife arranged hospitality for all these British pilots who'd come to be trained at Clewiston. And along with 2 others, I was most weekends in a beautiful little house right on the shore. You just walked out onto the beach and down to the ocean with these enormous waves coming in. The owner was a journalist in New York, and she only came down in the winter. It was terrific relaxation after the flying during the week.
And what was the layout of the actual camp?
Yes, good question. Because they had to carve it out of the swamp, you see. It was about half a mile square, and it had drains round the edge of it, which were populated by alligators and rattlesnakes, of which there were enormous numbers. Then, in the middle of that square, there was a diamond shape where there were the accommodation blocks, the mess hall, the swimming pool, the canteen, the instruction rooms, and all the things to do with servicing the aircraft. So that's how it looked from the air. You had a great big square, and in the middle there was this diamond where everything was concentrated. We flew 2 types of aeroplane. The first one was the Stearman, which was rather like a Tiger Moth on which most of us had flown solo, but it was bigger and it was more powerful. And it was on that we learned the basic skills. We learned what to do when you got into a spin. We learned how to fly low. We learned how to get from one place to another. We learned a lot of aerobatics because that was terribly important in a small plane. We then went on to a much different plane called a Harvard, which was a monoplane. It had an enormous engine with a very characteristic roar, and it had a retractable undercarriage. So this was like a serious fighter plane, but it had room for two, an instructor and a pilot. And it was that was the serious plane on which the second part of the training was done.